Welcome to Inside XCity, a behind-the-scenes look at the journalists and their work.
Sophie Laughton has been investigating city's hygiene measures during the pandemic for XCity magazine.
So, how did you go about investigating this story?
So it was an FOI piece. So I sent it off mid-February on Valentine's Day, which is nice and sad. And so I just asked them how much the university as a whole has spent on PPE, so face masks and shields, hand sanitizer, antibacterial spray, cleaning materials, that kind of thing. Then it was several weeks of chasing up the university, and right at the end of March, I think early April, finally got the results back, and they weren't quite what I was expecting.
So was it at that point that you realised that this information was enough for a news story?
I think so, yeah. It was, yes, like I said, it wasn't quite what I was expecting. And when I did a little bit more research around the topic and found out what other universities had spent, it became quite clear that there was quite a disparity in the numbers, and that was definitely worth looking into.
So we're joined by the editor of XCity. Can you tell us about your feature for XCity magazine?
Yeah, so I wrote a feature about the black reporters that reported about the Black Lives Matter protests last summer. I interviewed Malika Bilal, who's a journalist from Al Jazeera, and Daniel Henry, who's a BBC journalist and documentary maker, and he produced a BBC Three documentary that focused on the George Floyd case as well as the Black Lives Matter protests in London.
Amazing. And so we wanted to know, in terms of the journalists that you spoke to, did you deliberately get both a UK and a US perspective on the protests?
Yes, so I feel like I think last year exposed that racism wasn't just a US problem, as it often is seen to be, and often the media helps perpetuate that narrative. So it was important for me to get a US-based journalist, obviously because the whole story kind of came from the US, and then also showcasing a British journalist so that I could show that the issue isn't just an American issue, it's a global issue, as was kind of seen from all the protests that happened everywhere.
And when you spoke to them, was there anything that particularly kind of stood out, anything surprising?
I think it was kind of the way they both described their experiences in the protest. So Daniel used the word breathtaking and Malika used the word exhilarating, and I was kind of surprised because I remember being very, very exhausted by that news cycle at that time, and I wasn't even there or a journalist, so I thought it was and they did both talk about how mentally exhausting it was, but using those kind of words, exhilarating and breathtaking, I was kind of surprised. But when you actually read the article and you see why they described it that way, then you get a better sense of why they had that experience.
Is there anything that you think journalists can take away from their reporting of the protests?
Yeah, I think when there's these kind of stories in the news cycle, other journalists, well, I'm talking mainly about white journalists here, could provide more support, I guess, for their black colleagues in the newsroom, because stories like this are very, very exhausting for both mentally, emotionally, for these reporters, especially and I remember Malika mentioned, because she wasn't actually assigned the story. She went out because she felt the need to, because she felt like she had a personal attachment to the story. And as great as that is, it's also exhausting. So I think what other journalists can remember is, what they should remember is, just kind of being there, I guess, for their colleagues in times like this, because unfortunately this wasn't the first time, and it's happened very recently again. So yeah, it's providing support, I guess.
Tune back in next time when we talk top tips for finding story ideas.